The question I am asked most often when someone finds out that I only provide predictable flat fee pricing in my law firm is, how do you deal with the variables? Welcome to A Different Practice. I'm your host, Lauren Lester, and I'm obsessed with all things business, well-being, and optimizing the practice of law for solo and small firm lawyers. I started my solo practice right out of law school, built it from the ground up, and now work 4 days a week while earning well over 6 figures. I'm here to share tangible, concrete tips and resources for ditching the legal profession's antiquated approach and building a law practice that optimizes growth and enjoyment. Think of this as grabbing coffee with your work bestie, mixed with all the stuff they didn't teach you in law school about how to run a business. Pull up a seat, grab a cup, and get ready to be encouraged and challenged. This is A Different Practice. How do you deal with the variables? This is a fair question because every case that walks in the door is going to have something unique about it. Humans are humans after all. But accounting for variables when it comes to predictable pricing isn't as difficult as we might think, as long as we're willing to put the work in. So today we're going to cover 3 ways to handle variables with predictable pricing. And to jump in, we're first going to go on a little trip. Think of your favorite destination somewhere far away and pack your bags mentally in your brain. Of course, to get there, we'll first need to enlist the airline's help. So we go to buy a plane ticket and we realize it looks as though the airlines have maybe changed things up a bit. We can see a departure and arrival location. We see a date of departure and a scheduled time. But now instead of giving us a fee, the cost just says we'll take $1,000 up front, which will be billed against for the flight. And then anything beyond that, you'll get an invoice at the end to pay. Since this is the only way we can get to our dream destination, I guess this is what we're doing now. On the day of the trip, we wake up excited and ready to go. We pack our last few items and make our way to the airport. When we get there, we find out that there's been some weather delay and that the plane arriving to our airport is now delayed. So that means our scheduled departure time is going to be pushed back. By how much? They aren't quite sure yet. Once the plane does arrive, there's now a maintenance issue that the crew needs to work on. But one of their people has called in sick, so they're scrambling to find someone else to be able to help. We approach the gate since there's been some delays and we're curious as to what's going on and when we're actually going to be taking off. But no one's really there to answer our questions. It's kind of hard to get a hold of anybody. When we're finally asked to get on the plane, we are so excited. Thank God we are moving forward. Our ticket doesn't have any information about a seat number, so we just figure we can pick whatever seat we want. Luckily, one of the first few rows is open, and since this is a little bit of a longer flight, we want that extra leg room. Once the flight takes off, our phone immediately connects to the Wi-Fi, so we start streaming our favorite movie since we've got a little bit of time to kill. While we're watching, the flight attendant comes around and asks if we'd like anything to drink. We order a hot tea because it's getting late and we'll probably doze off a little bit, which will be a nice way to pass the time. Just as we close our eyes, we feel some turbulence and the captain comes on saying, there's more weather issues and unfortunately we're going to have to be diverted. We can't land in our destination. We have to wait for this weather to pass. So the plane lands somewhere else. We sit on the tarmac, the plane gets refueled, and then we can finally take off again. Finally, we arrive in our dream location, jump out of our seat because we cannot wait to get off this plane and rush towards the door. As we approach, the captain hands us a piece of paper. It's an invoice for the flight. It says, thanks for paying us that $1,000 retainer, but that was used up while you were sitting back at the airport waiting for the plane to arrive. The weather delay means it took more time than we were expecting. Then we had to bring in a special maintenance worker since the regular guy called in sick. The special guy's rate is a lot higher than our normal guy, and it took longer to fix the issue. When you got on the plane, you chose a seat that had extra legroom, so that's a line item for an extra cost. You also streamed on the Wi-Fi for a couple of hours, so we charged you for that time as well. And down in the expenses, we charged you for the hot tea that you ordered. Because the flight had to be diverted and took twice as long to arrive at the destination, you have to pay for that extra time too. So here's your invoice. Thanks so much for flying with us, but you owe us an additional $3,000. Would you pay that bill? I wouldn't. I don't think many of us would. When we ask the airlines, they say, well, we did what you asked us to do. We got you from one place to the other. It just took longer than expected. These things happen, but you owe us this money. For us as the consumer, the pricing is pretty opaque. At no point did we get any indication of how much this total cost would be. We thought that the $1,000 would cover it because that made sense to us. If we would have known that it was going to be $4,000 in total, we might have made a different decision. Maybe we wouldn't have gone on this trip right now, or maybe we would have picked a different destination. Even if maybe we would have made the same decision, even if the $4,000, we would have sucked it up and paid it. Not having been able to make that decision up front, knowing all of that information is what the problem is. And if it sounds familiar, it's because there's a reason. This is exactly how the legal profession approaches pricing with consumers. And if it sounds like it's a terrible experience for consumers, you're absolutely right. So how do we change it? This is where predictable pricing comes in. But the concern that we always hear is, well, but there's so many variables. Every case is different. And that's absolutely right. Every case is different. But the variables are something that we learn with experience and oftentimes have the data to back up. When we're on a consultation with a prospective client, in our heads, as this client is talking, we're going through and checking off variables. Oftentimes, we will ask additional questions to get information to learn what those variables might look like. We do it naturally. We just don't think of it as variables, but it's exactly the same thing. If you're in a new practice area or newer to the profession and maybe don't have the expertise or the data to be able to rely on, it's a really great opportunity to pair up with a mentor to be able to get that knowledge base. Process mapping is also a great tool to be able to sit down and think about, okay, what is everything that could be involved in this particular type of case? What are all the things that could come up that we may have to deal with, or that may make things more complicated, or that may take us down a different path? Being able to identify categories and factors and start to organize them is the first way to start to tame the variables. Think about the plane example that we just went through. Most of the time when you fly, your experience goes according to plan. You leave on time, you arrive on time, and nothing unusual happens along the way. But as our example showed, sometimes things don't go as smoothly. Maybe there are weather issues, maintenance issues, or your luggage gets lost. And all of those are unpredictable variables, right? Well, not exactly. While no one can predict what the weather will be, we know it exists and it can change at any moment. Having completed millions of flights over several decades, airline companies know that weather is a factor that they must consider, so they use data to help them understand patterns and anticipate weather events. By using this data, airline companies help ensure their value-based ticket prices covers their costs. Whether it's the weather or any of the other 60 plus variables, that's 60, that airline companies deal with on a daily basis, they still offer a fixed upfront price for every flight. If you consider our airline example, you likely would have expected the airline company to factor in weather into the price because they are the experts in air travel. The airline industry isn't alone. Companies in many different industries deal with all kinds of variables, but still are able to provide fixed upfront pricing. The legal industry should be no different. Is every case unique and do many variables exist in our profession? Absolutely. But like how airline companies factor in weather, we can use our expertise to identify the vast majority of these variables and account for them in our pricing. So let's talk about exactly how to do that. Once you've listed what values you provide through a particular service, you want to make sure to factor in the variables. To start, identify all the variables for that particular service. What are the known unknowns and what are the unknown unknowns? What are the what, you say? It's important to understand the difference between these two concepts. Known unknown variables or factors are events or circumstances we know could potentially happen in a case. They go beyond the standard steps we would expect in a basic case and are likely to occur in more complex matters. For example, in a divorce case, we might need temporary orders. Civil litigation might require more in-depth discovery. An immigration case may be thrown into limbo because the laws changed. The other party may file a motion for this, that, and the other. Like the airline companies, because you can't anticipate that these variables could occur, you must account for them in your pricing. There are 3 ways to do this. 1, limit the scope and exclude the known unknowns. 2, include a risk premium to cover the known unknowns. And 3, charge a flat fee for an initial phase to better understand those known unknowns. Let's dig into each approach. The first approach is to account for the known unknown variables by limiting the scope of your representation to only the necessary standard steps and to exclude the known variables. While you need to disclose and ensure the client understands what's included and what's not, it's also best practice to let the client know up front what the additional cost would be if any of those known unknown variables actually occur. For example, if you're working with a client looking to file for divorce and limiting the scope of your representation to only the standard steps that every divorce case goes through, you would explain to the client that because work related to temporary orders, valued at let's say $2,500, isn't necessary in every divorce case, it's not going to be included in this engagement. By doing it this way, the client isn't paying for something they don't need. But if, however, the need for temporary orders actually does arise in their case, you can enter into a new agreement for that additional work for an added set fee. Because you discuss the scope of work and the potential additional costs with the client up front, there's no surprise to them. The client still controls whether they expand your representation, and this limited scope approach works best for clients who are budget conscious. It's also a really good fit if there's a possibility of trial, but you just don't have enough information at the beginning of the representation to know whether or not that's going to be required yet. If you limit the scope of your representation to exclude trial, once you have more information, you can cover that known unknown in a new engagement agreement if that additional work is actually needed. The second approach to account for the known unknown variables involves taking the likelihood that a particular event will occur and spreading the cost across all cases that may require it. In other words, you include a risk premium in the price. Using the example about possibly needing temporary orders in a divorce case, if you know that 15% of the divorce cases you handle require temporary orders, you would include a risk premium by taking the price for pursuing temporary orders, which we said was about $2,500, and multiplying it by the occurrence percentage, which is 35%. To cover the additional work related to temporary orders, that means every new divorce case would include a $375 risk premium baked into the price without regard to whether the particular case actually needed temporary orders. If a case doesn't need temporary orders, that extra profit margin is used to offset the 15% of cases that do require temporary orders. This approach works really well for clients who are not budget conscious and value absolute price certainty. The third approach to account for the known unknown variables is to charge a flat fee for a first small phase of a case so that you can learn a little bit more and get a better sense of the particular needs of the client and the matter. Once you have a clearer understanding of the potential variables, you would enter into a new agreement for the next phase or even the remainder of the case. You may incorporate one of the first 2 approaches, limiting the scope or including a risk premium, to account for any additional variables that could come up. With this approach, the first small phase can either end at a particular milestone, like let's say mediation or a case management conference, or it can end after a particular amount of time, let's say 6 months. Alternatively, you can create your own first small phase outside of the traditional legal process, in which case you review the case in detail to determine not only the potential variables, but also the strengths and weaknesses of the client's position. While many of us can understand known unknown variables, we are lawyers after all, issue spotting is kind of what we do, the more difficult variable to account for are those unknown unknowns. These are the acts of God, things you really couldn't have anticipated would occur. Examples of unknown variables include learning that the other party in a divorce case has a second family in another state, that the building at the center of your transaction burned down after a lightning strike, that your immigration client now has a pending criminal charge, or, we don't know, maybe a global pandemic. Because the occurrence of unknown variables is hopefully pretty rare, you can't accurately account for them in your pricing. You just don't have the information, and sometimes it's just not even in your imagination to come up with. Rather, you would deal with any of those additional work requirements as they come up. And if it is a truly unknown variable that happens, clients are likely to be pretty understanding and work with you to figure out a solution. It's when you ask the client for more money because you classified an event as an unknown variable, when really you should have been able to anticipate it and account for it. Remember the weather for the airlines company? That's when the client gets upset and the relationship begins to break down. To give you some real life examples of how variables come into play and how they all sort of work together within a particular case, let's go through 3 different scenarios of potential clients that might walk into your family law firm. So we would have already gone through and identified the services that we provide and the value that we give the client by providing those services. And then we sit down and think about what are the variables that we would need to account for a particular service. Let's say it's a custody dispute. So some of the variables that we would list are things like, what is the level of disagreement and animosity between the parties? That's going to make a huge difference whether they can relatively get along or can't stand to be in the same room. Whether there's an opposing counsel or not. We all know that there are certain colleagues of ours who are going to make a case much more contentious and complex and drawn out than others who are there to really solve a problem. The communication time with the client, the other party, the other lawyer, or other third parties is going to be a variable that we need to account for. If we've got a client who needs a lot more handholding, we want to make sure that we factor that in. The possibility for emergency motions or temporary orders or even a party seeking a protection order are all things we want to make sure that we consider. There also may be a court-appointed investigator or expert who's going to be involved. And then, of course, whether or not there would be a contested hearing. Because variables don't happen in a vacuum, let's consider 3 different potential clients who might walk into our firm so that we can see how the variables are going to play together. The first client comes in. These are parents that have been working together for some time now and are really just looking for their agreement to be memorialized. There's no anticipation of an opposing counsel, the parties are really reasonable and communicative, and they generally have their agreement already set. I'd consider this case a just need it in writing. The best way to handle the variables here is likely to limit the scope. We would offer this client a service where she would get just the standard steps of a custody case, but we would outline that if something unexpected happens, like the other party gets an opposing counsel and makes things more contentious, or the need for temporary orders arises, that we would come back to her and give her the option to expand the scope to include that additional work. Our second potential client comes in. These are parents who have not spoken in years. The potential client is unsure where the other parent is actually located and what schedule they would even want. The client is pretty uneasy about starting this process and is definitely going to need some more counseling to feel comfortable. It's unclear whether there will be an opposing counsel or if trial will be necessary. I would consider this type of case hope for the best but prepare for the worst. And to account for the variables here, in particular whether a trial will be needed at the end, this may be something where we limit the scope to again include the standard steps, but also include a risk premium that would cover that contested hearing if one is needed. If any other variables come out, like temporary orders or emergency motions or experts that get appointed, those would still be out of scope, but we would have that conversation with the client up front so that they knew if a contested hearing is needed at the end, that's going to be covered, but one of these other variables that could or could not happen, that would need to be addressed if it does come up. The third case comes in and these parents argue over every little thing. They have an existing schedule, but neither of them believes that it's working. It's unlikely they will reach an agreement. That's pretty clear. And it's also likely that some sort of expert is going to be needed to help sort through all of the allegations that both sides are making. The other party is represented by a firm that is known for increasing litigation, so we know that likely additional discovery, temporary orders, possibly even a protection order is probably going to come up. Trial too is also pretty likely, but it's hard to know the scope of all the issues at this point. Handling the variables in this case, where the parties are just on the opposite sides of the field, might be best by doing that initial exploratory phase to learn more about the needs of the case and this particular client. Once that initial phase is complete, you'd have a better understanding of what additional work might be needed and then can determine how to approach the variables for that additional work. Working with variables, especially when it comes to predictable pricing, is something that just takes time and practice. So here are 3 tips on how to get started today, just to start to feel more comfortable with talking about variables, identifying them so that you can feel good about incorporating them if you are interested in incorporating predictable pricing into your practice. First, if you have the information and you have some years behind you in terms of practicing, is go back and look through your cases for a particular type of matter. So whether that's drafting an owner's agreement or a particular type of litigation case or an immigration case or a family case, whatever it is, identify a particular type of matter that someone might come to your office seeking help with, and go back through each individual case and pull out the variables that came up. You might, see a certain client's name and like, oh man, that guy was really a talker. So translate that into, okay, communication time is going to be a variable. What does the client need? Maybe one of the other variables when you look at an owner's agreement is how many owners there's going to be. So that could be a variable for that particular type of matter. So you want to go through and just think back to cases, review your time tracking records, review the work product, and see what comes up, what can you pull out that made that case anything other than the vanilla, bare bones, absolute minimum that would have been required to complete that type of matter. And just start making a running list. It doesn't have to be anything fancy, but just start connecting those dots as to what are the variables that came up that you had to deal with or that maybe changed course for that particular client. Once you've started to get a pretty good list, take a look at it and start organizing those variables and see if you can identify ones that maybe happen more often, ones that you need to make sure and have a checklist for every new owner's agreement that walks in your door. You need to make sure you hit these 3 things because 90% of the time they're going to be factors. Maybe you can categorize which factors don't happen together. So maybe you find that for cases where there's a protection order, that same type of case, none of those had an expert that was appointed by the court. So you can kind of know, okay, those 2 variables are not ones that are likely to come up together in that particular type of case. And then maybe you can identify which types of variables are almost interchangeable, not in the sense that they maybe are one for one, but in the sense that maybe the amount of effort that is needed or the effect on the case isn't really different, whether there's temporary orders or whether there's a discovery request. Now, if you have both of those, obviously you need to account for both of those, but kind of looking at them independently, they both kind of fit into the same bucket in terms of the effect on the case. Start to look at the variables, identify them, start to categorize them, and really see if you can create buckets and almost a hierarchy system for different things that could come up in a particular type of case. And then you want to think about, if someone walked in the door looking for this particular type of help, you've got these variables in front of you, these factors that need to be considered, how would you handle them when talking to this new client if some of these variables started to become more likely to happen in this particular client's case? Just think through what that might look like. If it's that they need some more communication time, or maybe they're going to need weekly updates from you because that's just the kind of client they are, or they really want to understand every single part of this process. And so they would really like some sort of knowledge base that they can go to. Identifying what those would be and how we might handle them is a good way to just practice accounting for variables when it comes to predictable pricing. So just doing this exercise of identifying, categorizing, and then accounting for variables will start to build that muscle. Not saying that the next client who comes into your office and is looking for that particular type of work, you should necessarily dive into predictable pricing, because there's a lot more that goes into that process. And we go through that in the pricing toolkit. But starting with the variables, which can be one of the trickier parts of the process, just because we're not used to thinking about variables in that way. And a lot of us kind of take the approach of, well, every case is different, so we'll just kind of deal with it as it comes up, right? But that's not a great experience to the consumer, as we saw in our hypothetical airplane example. Being able to have those conversations up front, set those expectations from the beginning, is really going to build a better attorney-client relationship. And that starts with us being able to identify the variables and communicate them to our clients so that they know the possibilities of things that could happen. going through and getting used to doing that, identifying them and thinking about how you might account for them is going to be a really great way to get your arms around variables, feel more comfortable with them. And then when you dive into the entire predictable pricing process and pricing your services based on value and not time, you will just be a whiz through the variable portion of it because you will have much more confidence in dealing with those, knowing that you are accounting for them properly, that you aren't missing anything, that you're not going to be doing work that you're not going to be paid for, but that you are going to be more upfront with your client and they will be much happier about paying the bill when they have all the information from the beginning. I'm over here giving you a virtual high five because you just finished another episode of A Different Practice. For more from this episode, head over to adifferentpractice.com/podcast for show notes and links to resources. If you found this episode helpful, let me know by leaving a rating wherever you listen to your podcasts. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode. If you're looking for even more practical tools to optimize your law practice for growth and enjoyment, be sure to sign up for our monthly newsletter. The link is waiting for you at adifferentpractice.com/subscribe. I can't wait for you to tune in next time. Until then, keep building a different practice.